Hello, my name is Jocelyne Cesari. I am a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs. And I will be your host today for our seminar on national versus transnational secularism perspective from South Asia and Southeast Asia. And before I introduce our guest, Clement Six, let me remind you that this video is recorded and that you will be able to look at it at your leisure if you cannot make part of all of it. And you will receive the link to the video if you have signed up for the event. I also would like you to be aware that you can ask questions. You have a question and answers function at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to ask along the way, and we will take into account your remarks or questions during the Q&A session. So let me introduce Clement Six, who is a professor of contemporary global history at the University of Groningen, and he has a focus on South and Southeast Asia history. And his book, Secularism, Decolonization and the Cold War in South and Southeast Asia, was published in 2018. He is also an invitee or guest here because he contributed to our Brill perspective on religion and politics. And his essay is called The Transnationality of the Secular. And so this talk and exchange with Clement Six is part of our research project called Fostering Interdisciplinary Approach to Religion and Politics. So Clemens, before I give you the floor, I would like to locate our exchange in this broader field, ongoing discussion, how to revisit secularism, since we know that the paradigm of secularization has pretty much failed or is seen as irrelevant to understand the status of religion today in most societies. And what I like very much in your work, and I'm sure you can explain this at length, is that two things. First is that you are on the side of the scholars who do not think that it's necessary to find new vocabulary to design or to understand the phenomena of secularization across the world today. And as you know, the debate is pretty much divided between the one who rightly criticized secularism as an ideology that has been imported or imported across societies and taken on in different non-Western contexts, but it's also a term that actors everywhere are using to interact and to propose alternative ways of secularization that were not part of the initial European or Western project. And I have read you, and it looks like your work is on the second aspect, meaning how can we restitute the agency of these actors who, of course, have received a term that was not part of the initial vocabulary or repertoire, but that has been endorsed by lots of these local actors with different consequences and different outcomes. So this is something that comes very strongly in your contribution to the Brill perspective. The other point that is also original is the fact that you look at secularism not from the national or state approach, but from a more transnational and historical perspective, and pay a lot of attention to network and actions by non-state actors in different contexts. So we are very eager to hear you and hear about your research with the focus on South Asia and Southeast Asia. Thank you, Clemens, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn, for having me. It's a great pleasure that I can contribute to your intellectual exchange. And I would request Ruth now to start the presentation. I prepared a couple of slides. Maybe in terms of organization, we have agreed that I would talk for 15-20 minutes or so, give you an idea of what my argument is. I've tried to be as concise and to the point as possible, and then we can open the floor for discussions. The talk is titled National versus Transnational Secularism, Perspectives from South and Southeast Asia. And I want to, in my first slide, Ruth, can you? Yeah, great. I want to start from a very rich body of literature that meanwhile exists on what we could call globalizing secularism studies. I find these works extremely inspiring, and they are also very important as a sort of a broader context in order to understand what my argument is about. This is just a very small selection of recent publications that have come out over the last couple of years that I personally find very inspiring. Basically, what I mean by globalizing secularism studies is that we're scholars of secularism, especially scholars who look into the history of secularism, are trying to globalize our perspectives, to move away from the very classic field of study of European history or Western history, and move beyond. And out of this body of literature, I want to take three important lessons that sort of define the direction in which we are going in these latest publications, in order to highlight this sort of broader scholarly context. Now, the first kind of lesson I think that comes very clearly out of these books is that it is quite fruitful to deploy a global comparative approach to illustrate the diversity of state religion arrangements and how they evolved through time, especially during the 19th and 20th century, to get a better feeling for the diversity that is out there and that has evolved historically. This sounds rather banal, but you know, simply to map out this diversity and then to see, okay, what kind of terminologies can we deploy, can we apply in order to make sense of this diversity? How can we group different communities of state religion arrangements in order to identify certain types that are out there? I think that is simply mapping the diversity is a very, very important result and message from these publications. A second lesson that comes out of these publications is that we move beyond Western history as the standard setting history when it comes to the definition of secularism. So we can, you know, we try to study local variations of secularism, especially in the colonial and post-colonial context, in their own right, not only as derivatives or as copies or you know, watered down versions of Western secularism, Western forms of secularism, but really as original, locally strongly rooted forms of state religion arrangements. And the third point, I think that's very important, is, especially for what I would like to do in this brief input, is the importance of the colonial administrative and institutional legacies. I think this is pretty undisputed amongst, you know, the different schools that are out there. Colonialism, the colonial past, and the evolution of the colonial state, of colonial statehood, was a very, very important legacy, a very, very important framework for post-colonial forms of secularism, post-colonial forms of state religion arrangements. And there's another important aspect to this that Shahbam Mahmood has highlighted, and Talal Asad and others who said, you know, these variations of secularism that we see on a truly global scale for the 19th, 20th century at least, are integrated elements of what they call a universalizing project to subordinate the global South. So this is strongly connected to power relations. This aspect of international power relations and the evolution of different secularisms, I think, is a very important aspect. Okay, next slide, Ruth, please. Okay, in the context of these arguments that I have now outlined, resulting from the literature that we have, I see three main challenges that we have in understanding, in our efforts to understand colonial and post-colonial forms of secularism, not only in South and Southeast Asia, but more on a global scale. One is, a challenge is to not overemphasize, or the tendency to overemphasize colonial agency. That means colonial bureaucrats, colonial administrative apparatuses in their meaning for various forms of secularism during the colonial period, as well as for post-colonial secularism. So there's no way we can deny the importance of the colonial legacies, but there is a certain risk that we overemphasize colonial agency, and that is one of the points that I would like to make. Second, what I see from these volumes, especially the edited volumes with various authors, where people, very thought-provoking studies are contributed on individual societies and nations, is that we sort of sustain the imperial and national compartmentalization, so that we study, secularism as it evolved in the British Empire, parallel to secularism, how it has evolved in the French Empire. And for the post-colonial period, the same story, that we basically study secularisms as national histories in parallel to each other, and we don't see the linkages enough between those. Okay. And the third aspect that the third challenge I would like to put on the table is that I think there's a tendency in the existing research to be too focused on state actors. That means governments, ministerial, administrative staff, governmental bureaucrats, state apparatuses, in order to explain statehood. It is, of course, very logical that that state actors are very important to explain statehood, the evolution of statehood. But I think there's much more to the story that goes beyond governments, bureaucracies, administrative bodies. Okay, so on this background of the existing literature and the challenges that I have now identified, here is the argument that I would like to make in this brief talk, namely that political secularism in the 20th century in post-colonial societies, and my examples come from South and Southeast Asia, were co-determined to a very, very important extent by trans-imperial and transnational travels of ideas, social networks, and circuits of expertise, initiated and sustained by non-state actors. Or you could also rephrase it as a sort of question, namely, what was the contribution of trans-imperial, transnational mobility of ideas, social networks, and circuits of expertise to the evolution of political secularism? And what was the role of non-state actors or non-governmental actors? So that is the question that I would like to ask. Okay, next slide, Ruth, please. Thank you. Before we start, I would like to also briefly say what I mean by political secularism in order to avoid confusions. There's a strong debate on terminology out there, so I think we should be very clear what that means. By political secularism, I mean sort of a family resemblance of state practices and political ideas. So that's very important. I'm not only talking about ideas, as some people have when they talk about secularism or as a form of ideology, okay, but also practices. There is a very important practical dimension to political secularism, I think, that we have to integrate when we talk about political secularism. And this family resemblance of state practices and political ideas is meant to initiate or maintain a strategic distance between the state and religious communities and beliefs. Okay. Why do I call this strategic distance? Well, strategic basically means that this incorporates a whole range of different settlements and approaches between the state and religion. So strategic means also that it depended on the political context, on the power interests of certain elites, on colonial as well as post-colonial elites. And these power interests, these political strategic interests, have strongly influenced how these elites have approached religion in their temporary settlements between the state and religion. Okay, and strategic also means that it accommodates a whole range of different forms of cooperation between the state and religion, different forms of control as well as intervention from the state into religious affairs, as well as the other way around. And why I call this, the reason why I call this family resemblance is that this is not a homogeneous group of settlements between state and religion. So this is more characterized by a sort of a shared aspiration for this strategic distance, or a very loose assembly of different kinds of approaches, different kinds of settlements between the state and religion. Okay, one of my assumptions hereby is, with this definition of political secularism, that this is not only relevant domestically to understand politics and statehood in these societies, but this is a key feature in my reading of 20th century world history in general terms. Okay, so I recognize here, or I argue, that this is a key feature of 20th century world history and is thus, per definition, translocal. Okay, good. Next slide, Ruth, please. Okay, in order to substantiate my argument a bit more, I want to briefly zoom into one case that I've put forward in one of my publications. I have looked more into 5 case studies so far. This latest book that Jocelyn had mentioned contains 3 of them, and I just picked one of them in order to show you how the travel of ideas and the translocal exchange of ideas on statehood and political secularism has been developed and facilitated by non-governmental actors across, at times, very large distances. And the example that I've chosen for this talk is on women's networks for a secular state. Why women's networks or women's movements in Asia, in South and Southeast Asia? Because I think secularism studies, and also the globalizing version, is a bit weak until now when it comes to female agency. So that's understandable, of course, in one way, because, you know, colonial elites, bureaucratic elites also in post-colonial societies were strongly male-dominated. But I think we have to enhance and refocus our attention towards female agency when it comes to the evolution of political secularism. So I find us in secularism studies a bit weak in this field. So that's why I would like to put forward this particular case. Now, a little bit of context. I have a colonial as well as a post-colonial example of how women's networks, women's movements have contributed to the evolution of political secularism in South and Southeast Asia. And from the overall picture, 20th century women's movements in India, Indonesia, and Singapore, and some other societies in that region had sustained a rather ambivalent relationship with the nation. On the one hand, we see very early on strong trends amongst these women's networks to internationalize, to transnationalize. Already after the First World War, we see strong efforts to coordinate across imperial boundaries and across national boundaries. That also included a form of, some scholars have this called maternal imperialism, of white women trying to tell, you know, non-white women how women's movements, women's activism works. So this early on, this effort to internationalize and transnationalize. At the same time, these feminisms, former feminisms, have very strongly remained within their local national context. So local women's struggles in Asia, South and Southeast Asia, remained very national in their framework, strategies, and goals for a very, very long time. So, and that's for sure the case for the colonial time period, but also in post-colonial decades, this was the case for a very long time. What we see for the colonial context, if we compare women's movements in India, Indonesia, Singapore, British Malaya, in the interwar period, we see that the Great Depression in the late 20s, early 30s was a sort of a threshold. From that moment on, women's movements in all of these societies were trying to unite the different fractions that existed amongst themselves, mobilize more women for political issues, and politicize women on a larger scale. So the event that I would like to zoom in is the first All-Asian Women's Conference that took place in January in 1931 in Lahore. Lahore was then British India. And this is a kind of event, an international gathering of women's rights activists that is usually under the radar of the grand histories of women's activism. It was significantly less smaller than the post-1945 women's conferences and big gatherings. But as I would argue, there were some important terms set for later female agency, for social reform and secular statehood already at that time. And that's why I would like to zoom into this conference a bit more. The explicit agenda of this conference was to transgress national boundaries and to coordinate women's struggles in various South and Southeast Asian societies in favor of women's rights in the colonial context. The initiator of this conference was the Women's Indian Association, in this case of Madras Presidency, so that's the southeast of of British India. And the whole conference was a huge organizational effort, a huge logistical effort. And it all started with a big disappointment because fewer female women's delegates could actually come than expected. These were difficult times, as you can imagine. You know, the anti-colonial movement in India, but also in other Southeast Asian societies were in full swing, were intensifying. The British authorities were also not very keen on having such a conference on its territory for various reasons. There was an economic crisis going on, so the circumstances were very difficult. And the overall tone of this conference, when it comes to the general issues that were discussed there, was rather, pan-Asianistic, I would say. There was sort of a diffuse discourse on Asian unity, in anti-imperialism. There was this rhetoric about the qualities of Oriental civilization that must be mobilized and activated in order to, shake off the imperial rule. And there was this plea, this promotion of unity of Asian women, as I quote, as members of a common Oriental culture. Okay, so this was the overall rhetoric. Now, the more interesting part for me here is the details of the discussion, and they are relevant when it comes to the evolution of ideas, of women's ideas on political secularism. There were attendants from different parts of British India, from Persia, from Burma, from Ceylon, and from Indonesia. And for the Indonesian women's movement, this conference was particularly important because this was the first time that they sent a delegation abroad and could participate live, physically, in translocal efforts to coordinate women's struggles. The discussions in detail were basically about the struggles of women against polygamy, about, for equal rights for women over the guardianship of children and property, for equal rights of divorce, adult franchise, and nationality, and so forth. So these are relatively classic topics at that time. But what is important here is that the means by which these women wanted to achieve those goals. And for most of the protagonists present at this conference, the secular state and political secularism as an approach towards, state-religion relationships was the most promising and actually the only hope for women, or the best hope that women had, in order to achieve those goals, a fight against polygamy, equal rights for women, and so forth. So what they were pleading for and discussing over and over again is the state in its role to produce and sustain a strategic distance in order to implement key social reforms, also and primarily against religious orthodoxies. So this does not mean that all of these participants were somehow a-religious or anti-religious, not at all. They were, for example, one hot topic was Hindu, Muslim, Christian instructions in schools. So there's a strong religious element also in there. But when it comes to women's emancipation, women's rights, and also girls' rights, the political secularism was the central tool that they were suggesting in order to achieve those goals. A political secularism for the colonial context, but also for in their visions for post-colonial times. Okay. Now, I would like to zoom in into one biography of this conference that in order to make this point even a bit more concrete. One of the most important conference participants was Muthulakshmi Reddy. She was one of the most outspoken contributors to the discussions in this conference, and her biography is really interesting, in order to give you an idea also how these ideas then translated into concrete political practices. So this was not a theoretical debate or a hypothetical debate, but had a concrete practical dimension to it. Reddy was a medical practitioner, and she was the first woman in British India to become a member of the Legislative Council. In her case, the Madras Legislative Council in 1927. So she was a lawmaker, basically. By the time of the conference in 1931, she had already retired. She had resigned from this position out of protest, political protest. But her task was basically to implement women's emancipation into laws within the existing state apparatus and state structures. Okay, one of her most famous achievements was the Act Against Temple Prostitution, which she found exploitative towards women and empowering males' control over women's bodies. And she was very explicit about this, that, you know, religious customs are used in Asian societies, not only in British India, but also in other Asian societies, in order to block women's rights. So legislative power for her and political secularism and secular statehood, and that, you know, as a form of strategic distance to orthodoxies and religion, was for her a central means in order to facilitate women's rights. Okay, good, Ruth. The next slide, please. Yeah, this is a post-colonial example of, you can also, you know, the relevance of these women's networks are also for the post-colonial context very important, and, as I would argue, underestimated so far in their contribution to the evolution of political secularism as a form of idea as well as forms of practice. And one example that I would like to briefly highlight is this UNESCO gathering in Calcutta in 1958. It's a coincidence that both of these events that I highlight are on Indian soil. There are also other examples. This happened in the context of you know, the aftermath of the foundation of UNESCO. Since November 1945, this organization existed. And its task was, as you may know, to promote the development of social sciences and education and intercultural understanding amongst its member states and member societies. The part of UNESCO that interests us here most is the Department of Social Sciences, that became particularly active in the second half of the 1950s. It was particularly dedicated to the promotion and teaching of social sciences in Asia and in Latin America. So those two regions were identified by the department as two core target regions. And then in Calcutta, 1958, there was an interesting gathering organized, and to my knowledge, there is no historiography on this gathering so far. The initiator, Barbara E. Ward, is a very interesting personality. She's not from India or any other Asian society. She was Hong Kong based, but a British social anthropologist, specialist on Chinese society. And she organized basically this get-together of important female, mainly female, but also some male scholars, activists from the region itself, from South and Southeast Asia, in order to bring them together and discuss one core question, namely, what is the impact of revolutionary decolonization, as they called it, so the revolutionary transfer of power. What is the impact of this revolutionary transformation on women and girls? And what they meant by impact was, you know, political consequences, legal consequences, economic and educational consequences for girls and women. So in how far, what did decolonization do to women and girls in all these fields? The shared interest of the participants was basically to see how the new forms of political freedom in many Asian, South and Southeast Asian societies was translating into concrete, practical, everyday life realities of women and girls. It's a very interesting discussion when you reconstruct what they were discussing, what they, you know, there are main issues that were classic at that time, namely urbanization, issues related to industrialization, political change, and so forth. But there are two core issues that they addressed in their discussions. Namely, first, how can there be a similar institutional changes achieved across South and Southeast Asia in order to open up new social roles and new economic opportunities for women and girls, by extension? That was the one. And the other one was, how can the growing global entanglements and interdependencies between societies be used in the favor of girls and women? So today we would say globalization. How can globalization be used in favor of girls and women's rights? Now, I have given you on the slides a list of participants. Some of you might recognize. For scholars of Indian history, for example, Rumina Thapar is a big shot, so everyone knows her. Shushila Nair was a Gandhian co-activist, so to say, and later on health minister under Nehru. Mimi Kaing was a Burmese educationist. Pramwan Dickinson was a UNESCO researcher from Thailand and also based in Thailand. So a broad network of scholars and activists who wanted to facilitate and exchange their ideas. Now, one of the issues that they covered in these discussions is a strong critique towards the persistence of what they call traditional attitudes. And what they mean by that is especially religiously orthodox conservative attitudes in various South and Southeastern societies, but particularly in Muslim majoritarian societies. And one of the countries that they criticize the most is Pakistan. That might have to do with the especially Indian attendance of this conference. But Muslim majoritarian societies were under strong scrutiny from these activists and intellectuals as far as women's rights and girls' rights is concerned. They also criticized the persistence of very conservative family types connected to these traditional attitudes. So conservative family types, especially in Thailand and in India, and they were considering ways how to overcome these conservative family types, how to intervene and implement more progressive forms of family types that would increase the space of maneuver for women, especially, and also for girls and their access, especially to education and other forms of social welfare. In their findings, that's a sort of a tenor that I find in the discussions of this conference, is that the social structures in South and Southeast Asian societies were the result in their repressive character towards women and girls, were the results of long-term dialectics with religious systems. So the persistence of these religious systems were blocking social reform. And only a secular state and political secularism, a strong government agenda that is very interventionist towards these persistent traditional attitudes and conservative orthodoxies, can facilitate and can enhance women's rights and women's emancipation. So again, we have this very strong plea for a secular state, for political secularism, as a sort of a strategic, namely motivated by social reform and social interventionism in the favor of women and girls, as the best way, the best strategy to facilitate these dearly needed reforms. And the hypothesis that they came up with, sort of a consensus that they came up with towards the end of their gathering, is that not religion as such has to disappear from these societies, but the state has to lead the way towards the transformation of religion. It has to intervene in religious affairs from a strategic distance in order to secure secular family values and generate the advancement, facilitate the advancement of women's affairs. Okay. So now I come to the end of my, Ruth, please, the next slide. Yeah. So I have some more specific observations on these regional women's networks, and then I have some more broader conclusions on my overall argument. So one of the first observations that I draw from these, this look into women's networks is that women's struggles for reform and secular statehood evolve at a relatively early stage. As early as the Great Depression, but even in the 1920s, we see some efforts already to transnationalize and to, especially go public with these kind of discussions. Go public at a trans-imperial level. So I think the colonial period is very important to understand the formation of these debates and exchange amongst women as far as political secularism is concerned. The second, the coordination efforts were important preparatory steps for the, in scholarly work, more visible lobbying after decolonization. In the 50s and 60s, these are the high times of women's internationalism. But I think it's important to see the interwar period. And then finally, women's networks did not alter or altogether challenge or turn upside down male dominance in state institutions, but their contributions to political secularism in the colonial as well as in the post-colonial period is more indirect, is more silent, probably also more nuanced, I should say, not silent, but more nuanced through the exertion of pressure to pressure the male-dominated elites in the anti-colonial context as well as in the post-colonial context in favor of a certain form of political secularism that could facilitate women's and girls' social status. Okay, and then my last slide, Ruth, and then I'm done. Thank you. You must know that women's networks are not the only example that I look into. I also look into the role of US private foundations, for example, in population policies in South and Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 60s. I also look into other kinds of discourses where ideas on political secularism were shared across large geographical distances. Again, in the colonial period, for example, around Ataturk's reforms in Turkey. I also look into international law and how the freedom of religion, as it was canonized in international law and within human rights after 1945, how that has globalized certain ideas about political secularism. So these are the more broader conclusions here that I would like to share. So these trans-imperial and transnational networks have facilitated the exchange of ideas and strategies of political secularism since the interwar period. Second, private initiatives and organizations, including foundations, they also altered policies. It's not only about a debate and about ideas, but they had concrete impact in policies. And lastly, they also shifted the discourse on secularism, political secularism, and state practices according to their political and social priorities, as I tried to show with the example of women's networks in the interwar and post-war period. Okay, then I stop here, and now we have time for discussion. I talked a bit longer than intended. Sorry for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clemens. So I'm going to start the discussion with you and include in the remarks also questions by the audience. So the first thing that came, and it's also very clear in some of the remarks on the Q&A, is what is exactly strategic distance? Because the term itself, or the terminology, implies a sort of common features, while it seems that what happened with secularization everywhere is actually the influence of different models. And one of the member in the audience mentioned that it's very difficult to understand secularism without taking into account, for example, the French-rooted laïcité and its influence in some parts of the Middle East or Africa versus the Indian secularism. It seems indeed that Indian secularism is more, I would say, strategy or distance oriented, while in the case of the French, it was a very intrusive, authoritarian way of controlling religion. And my own work in the Muslim world that is not part of South Asia shows that the state everywhere was far from being distant. It was a reshaping and a deep transformation of the religion itself by state institutions. So could you please clarify here what is strategic distance and how can you differentiate? Because again, it seems to me that here we are facing a particularity related to your local context more than a generalization of what really happened everywhere.
Yes, thank you, Jocelyn, and also to the audience for raising this issue. I fully agree that this is a problem here, that we have to, in the definition of our terminologies and our terms that we are using, we have to strike a balance between describing some general features about various forms of political secularism that we can summarize under a certain, however loose definition of the term, and at the same time remain sensitive in this definition for local variation. The range that you describe between a more liberal notion of political secularism and more interventionist up to very authoritarian forms of interventionism of the state in religious affairs, it does also exist within the region that I deal here with now in South and Southeast Asia. So if you compare, for example, the Indonesian form of secularism, political secularism, with the Indian form of secularism, there is clearly a lot of variation in there. What I mean by strategic is this does not exclude different degrees of interventionism and different degrees of authoritarianism in their approach to, in the state's approach to religion. But what I mean by strategic is that depending on the exact goal of the intervention and the agenda of, depending on the exact agenda of social reform and social transformation and also political transformation, because this is also about control, state authorities were choosing for different forms of distances to religious communities. So in some cases, even in the Indian case, that is generally described as a more liberal form of secularism. Even in the Indian case, the government was very, very interventionist when it comes to certain social customs, certain forms of orthodoxies and social control that they exerted over their communities. And in other cases, they were far more lenient, far more liberal. So what I mean by strategic is that it is process-oriented, this kind of interventionism, this kind of settlement between the state and religion, depending on power interests, interests of social reform, interests of control. So what I would like to indicate with this term of strategic distance is a certain flexibility and an adaptability of the state strategies towards religion, depending on the overall political goals, as far as social reform is concerned and religious reform.
But what needs, I would say, some more feedback from you is that it is not only a state action toward religion, because what is implied there is a separation between what is the state and what is religion, which may come indeed from the importation of the nation state and the Western model, but the reality on the ground was not as clear about, this is religion and this is politics. So when you start already talking about strategic distance, you are looking at the Westernized elite that may have a particular position vis-à-vis the religious establishment and the community on the ground, but there was some work done before that also contributed to this separation. To give you a concrete example, again, from something that I have looked into, not only in the Muslim world, but in India as well, before this liberal version of I would say distanciation between state and all religion, you have a fantastic internal work done by people who are not state elite, but that have adjusted their religious tradition to this new division between, this is the state, this is political, and this is religion. And actually you have a whole discussion about Hinduism in its modern form being the outcome of this work. So in other words, it is interesting to look at political secularism, but again, and that's also part of your claim, it cannot just be limited to the state policy. And so the actors are not only the one that at some point will interact with the state, even before, and that's why I would like to see what is different between colonial and post-colonial. It was not clear to me that there was a strong difference there, and how these changes are not only in the policy, but I would say even in the mentality of people, on how they deal with politics and state institution and secularism.
Yeah, I agree, Jocelyn. What we see in many post-colonial states and society in South and Southeast Asia is that religion is acquiring a more central role in state policies, up to the point that religious authorities are actively incorporated into state bureaucracies, administrative apparatuses. While at the same time, there was also the effort to distance the state and sustain the distance and redesign this strategic distance between the state and religious affairs and religious circles and religious authorities. So also from the point of, you know, the state to establish its ultimate superiority over religious authorities does not exclude a very close relationship, cooperation, even integration of religious authorities into the state's apparatus.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're absolutely right. You know, these religious reform movements that you mentioned, they prepare the ground for this, but also for these women's networks that I've mentioned, they are not a-religious or anti-religious. Many of these women, these delegates who participate in this conference, come from women's movements with an explicit Islamic background. So, and they also say that, and they say, okay, we want religious education and instruction in our primary schools and in our secondary education. We want this to be a central element of our Asian civilization. So that is exactly what I try to make sense of. So this is not like in the West, this wall of separation idea, but it's a negotiation process which accommodates interventionism as well as, not only close cooperation, but also mutual entanglement between state and religion.
Yeah, I would argue that even in the West, it was never a separation.
Yeah.
There was always interaction and compromises and negotiation. If you think of the confessionalization of religion across Europe, it's far from being a separation and a sort of autonomous path between the state institution and the religion. But again, and there are a few objections and pushback in the Q&A. That's why okay. Someone is saying, but it's not just a difference between intervention and tolerance. It's a strategic difference between accepting religiosity, even promoting its legal promotion without preference, and on the other hand, it's outright rejection. So yeah. I can see that people are having a hard time to see how you can combine all these very opposite ways under strategic distance, Yeah. So we may not solve this now.
No, I fully agree with it, that this also includes promotion of religion, but there is always an element of, of exclusion in there, of marginalization of certain forms of religion, for example, certain forms of agnosticism and atheism, for example. But this is exactly the challenge here, and I think this is these are very distinct features of many Asian forms of political secularism, that they are not intolerant towards religion, but it's about transforming religion, incorporating it into the state's overall agenda of transforming society, and in this case also exclude certain forms of religion that do not fit into the overall mission of modernizing society, as this was called. But this is not an anti-religious or an a-religious agenda, not at all, in no case. So
another point that I would like to raise is your starting point is to say we are opening up and not focusing only on the state action and looking at non-state actors. But these non-state actors are actually contributing to the state power. I mean, in other words, they are not state related
yes.
or included, but they are part of what Foucault would call governmentality. They are part of these different segments of society, including scholars, that will reinforce the legitimacy of the state to intervene in a certain way. And your two examples are very striking about the responsibility put on the state by these women actors to change things, So it is non-state actors, but they are still part of this realm, and we are talking about elite that are using, interacting, communicating with the state actors and institutions at the same level. So, because we could also imagine non-state actors taking different routes, and again, I'm having in mind the pan-Islamists that were in the beginning very far from contributing to the state, action, and were actually challenging the nation-state unity. So I'm asking if they are equivalent of this, I would say, challenge from non-state actors that do not fit in this governmentality that you are describing.
Yeah, that's true. There are versions out there of religious reform and future politics of the post-colonial state that go beyond the nation-state framework. Not all of it is true that, of course, these women that I refer to here are also part of the elite. They're a certain kind of elite. Absolutely, they're not subaltern in that respect. Many of them are explicitly anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and some of them also have a vision of the future that is pan-Asian, and in that sense, they're aware of the problematic framework of the nation state, especially for their own, Asian societies. Many of these women are very clear that the national framework does not fit with the social stratification, the cultural landscape of their diverse societies. They're extremely pluralistic societies. So there is clearly an awareness here of. Sure. Other examples that would not fit into this kind of spectrum are communist movements who had a very different version of political secularism and also of internationalism for the time after the imperial era. And this is a spectrum that I have deliberately left out.
Oh, we lost.
Because
here we go.
I find it more interesting to have movements that we could dive into in order to analyze the more oppositional, clearly internationalist forms of political secularism with a very strong agenda towards religion and state.
Yeah. So
for the time after colonialism. Yeah.
So you are breaking away. So maybe I didn't catch all your response here, but I see the translocal aspect of it, meaning looking at non-state actors coming together across different localities and political contexts. But how is it different from, how do you distinguish it, to be more clear, from what you call trans-imperialism? I could not grasp here what is the difference, because it seems to me that these actors are still operating within the canopy or under the umbrella of the imperial institution that have been put on them, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, trans-imperial in my terminology refers to the colonial period, and what I mean by trans-imperial is networks that were cutting across boundaries of various empires. So women coming from the Dutch imperial sphere of influence, traveling to the British Empire and so forth. So these flows across imperial borders and spheres of influence, that is what I would like to. But you're absolutely right. As I showed also with Reddy's example, she was even an imperial legislator, if you want. An anti-colonial, anti-imperial legislator, but she was sitting in the British Indian Legislative Council. And the fine line that she wanted to walk is exactly the line between taking the opportunity to have an influence on imperial legislation within the confines and the institutions of the British Raj in South Asia, and at the same time, on the other hand, remaining strongly anti-colonial. And in the end, this kind of contradiction made her resign in 1930 when Gandhi was arrested for his anti-colonial activism, and she resigned out of protest because she said, we cannot move on in this kind of contradiction. No, I agree. And also the Indonesian women's movements were operating within the confines of the imperial framework. And as you said before, they are at some points of their agenda and their mobilization, they were more anti-colonial, anti-imperial state than in other discussions where they were working towards the cooperation and assistance from the imperial state in order to facilitate and advance their agenda. So yeah, absolutely. This was the game that they played, or the this delicate balance that they tried to strike between anti-colonialism and counting on the colonial state in order to facilitate women's and girls' agenda.
Yeah. So we have a few minutes left, and I would like to bring it to today. Does this historiography of networks between and after the colonial period can help us understand what are the challenges of secular cultures or issues in some of the societies you have studied? I'm thinking of Indonesia or India. What would be your outlook today, knowing what you know about some of the issues? It may be a tough question, so feel free to adjust it as the way you want, but how much does it inform the current challenges in some of the countries you have studied?
Yeah, very much so. There's a strong influence. My interpretation of the rise of Hindutva in India, so the Hindu nationalism that is now ruling the country, democratically ruling the country, as well as under the surface of the more visible democracy, they're also ruling the country now. This is very much a consequence of some flaws and contradictions of political secularism from the early days of the Republic. So I would say that precisely because, coming back to my terminology, precisely because this interventionism was very strategic, and in that sense very situational, very driven by ad hoc power relations, and not very principled. And there's not a principled distance to various religious communities, as well as various forms of orthodoxy and conservatism. Because it was strategic, this distance, there were also some inbuilt flaws of political secularism in the Indian case. And these flaws we see now facilitated by different changes in the context, and there is, of course, a problem with the overall political system in India. But I would say the current situation in India that we see is precisely a combination of the outcome of this strategic distance realized within this framework of political secularism in India, and some more recent changes in the overall framework and socioeconomic transformations of Indian society over the last 2-3 decades. So for me, this is a long-term consequence of these core features of political secularism in India.
Yeah. I completely agree with that, because there is this tendency today to look at the BJP as a sort of recent reaction against the secular state, while your work and other historiography show that actually this discussion on the role of the Hindus within the Indian nation has been inherent to the secularism of India. And if we don't restitute this particular context, we're going to keep saying, like I have seen also in Muslim countries, Islamism is a reaction against the secular state. No, Islam is pan-Islamism, but been part of the discussion brought by the secular project of the West. So there is a lot of work to do here in connecting this genealogy of what happened in the past to understand the present. Mm-hmm. And that's part, I think, of the challenge where you are an historian. Most of the debate, let's be clear, on this kind of secularization is done today by either political scientists or sociologists who do not automatically take this historiographic approach. And not to make things more challenging, but this is I would say, the benefit of an interdisciplinary way that would not mean that you analyze the situation and a political scientist analyze it and we put it parallel, but how can we together work to look at the situation that will enrich each other? And that's a huge challenge today. Yeah. I would say it's more of a challenge for some parts of social science that have turned so unhistorical. That's a big challenge here.
Yeah. At the same time, I feel it's also a challenge for us to be more open towards social science discourses and as we have seen also with my manuscript that we discussed in the early stage, Jocelyn, I was very thankful for your comments in this respect. And then I realized, how we also have to change the way we speak, the way we analyze, the way we, in order to be compatible with more social scientific approaches, and that is really a challenge, for us as well. Yeah.
So that's opening a huge new path. But thank you very much, Clement. This was a pleasure to have you. I just want to say that we have some comments on the Q&A that if you would like to address them more specifically, because they were very specific comments, please do so. And thank you all for your attention and interest, and see you maybe online and another event. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now. Bye.